there's still a lot of concentration of powers in one hand in the Philippines. At this point, we must have improvement in the country. We have to wait and see whether this new president will reinforce human rights or whether he will continue to disregard them. We've got experts with us today who are going to be telling us more in detail about the question. We have Pia Ranada from Rappler, and she has received as you know, it was a Philippine journalist who took the prize last year for journalism. We also have Julio Teehanke, professor at DLSU University, Manila, and Karen Gomez-Dumpit. I first of all give the floor to Pia Ranada. There is going to be a remote connection for Julio Teehanke, but Pia Ranada, I first give you the floor for 7 minutes.
Hello, good morning to everyone. I'm honored to be addressing the body. I will be speaking on the issue of disinformation campaigns in relation to the 2022 elections, which we just concluded. So allow me to read my remarks. On its face, the 2022 Philippine national elections was conducted successfully. With its record high voter turnout, the fact that we now have elected officials about to take their oaths of office, and most voters able to exercise their right to cast their ballot despite many cases of voting machine malfunctions and spates of violence in parts of the country. But if you tell me, a journalist, that the election was fair, honest, true, and free of coercion and deception, I would beg to differ. First, there is the rampant vote buying that we know has been happening in every election. But there is a second, more worrying trend of deception: the use of social media to spread falsehoods meant to prop up politicians. Disinformation is in itself a poison to democracies, but disinformation used to demonize democratic pillars like the press is even more dangerous because it plants the seed of distrust in the very institutions meant to protect freedoms we all enjoy. The 2022 elections in the Philippines prove that the steps taken by social media platforms to rein in inauthentic behavior and protect users from deceptive actors are not working. Trolls hired for political propaganda are able to skirt rules by, for example, using videos and memes rather than text because they are harder to detect by algorithms. Political propaganda and revisionist narratives have migrated to platforms like TikTok and YouTube, where they are recast in hip-hop tunes, emojis, and funny TikTok challenges and fan cams. They found a new audience too: the Gen Z Filipinos, whose minds, for many communication and political strategists, are fertile ground for planting their alternative histories and grandly false narratives. Several studies, and even the actions of Facebook and Twitter, show that a lot of this inauthentic online behavior and propaganda have benefited two camps the most: incumbent President Rodrigo Duterte and presumptive President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. While even the opposition side has benefited from hired social media content creators and coordinated online behavior, a study has shown that during the early months of the election period, most election-related disinformation about Marcos Jr. was positive branding, while those about opposition candidate Vice President Leni Robredo were negative branding. Social media accounts supportive of Marcos and Duterte were also the primary culprits for online attacks and vilification of journalists and news organizations. In March 2019, Facebook announced it had taken down 200 Facebook groups, accounts, and pages, followed by millions of users due to inauthentic behavior. These accounts were overwhelmingly pro-Duterte and pro-Marcos. Numerous studies by universities, think tanks, and Rappler have detailed how online propaganda favoring Marcos has sought to whitewash our country's history. Online content, including those spread on TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook, proliferate blatant lies, like that the Philippines was an economic superpower during the Marcos dictatorship, that nobody was arrested during the Marcos regime, and that the Marcos family are in possession of gold bars, which they will distribute to Filipinos once they are in power. Political propaganda is not new. It's not even inherently evil. Politicians, of course, have the right to promote themselves to the public. What's different today? 1. The propaganda includes blatant lies. The lies can be told because the actors spreading the propaganda are protected by anonymity provided to them by social media platforms. 2. The propaganda now attacks democratic institutions and freedoms by using lies to vilify a critical and free press and attacking any dissenting voices that should have been protected by a democracy. The freedom of a few to advance their political careers has ended up stepping on the freedom of many to decide based on facts and truth and to express their grievances against the powerful. That Marcos won a majority vote in the 2022 elections is clear as day. But the rampant disinformation seeded in the minds of many Filipinos makes me wonder how much of our votes were based on lies instead of truths. This very doubt is worrisome. This very doubt makes me fear for our democracy and our future. Politicians here, including Marcos, of course deny they have anything to do with the online disinformation networks. Even if we take their word for it, the problem exists. Whoever is responsible for these networks have not been made to suffer any real consequences. At the heart of the problem is the fact that online disinformation has become a lucrative industry in the Philippines. A modern troll network can earn $38,000 to $57,000 per month, according to a report by the Washington Post. An influencer with 10,000 followers can earn from $5,800 to $6,800 during election period. Advertising and communication professionals are behind many of the fake social media accounts used for trolling, attacking the press, harassing dissenting voices, and spreading false narratives. But these professionals would not be engaging in this tactic if it did not make money. Politicians and even companies selling all kinds of products are the ones paying. They are the ones making lies profitable. And the more this arrangement is mutually beneficial, the more politicians will shield the industry from any form of regulation or consequences. 2 months ago, the government announced that President Rodrigo Duterte had vetoed the passage of a law that would have required persons to register their real names when creating a social media account or obtaining a SIM card. The measure would have ensured that actors with suspicious intentions would not be allowed to create fake social media accounts. That ability of a single person to man as many social media accounts as they have emails has been exploited by troll farms and anyone who does not want to be accountable for whatever they post on social media. There are legitimate concerns that regulation could impinge on freedom of speech. As a journalist, I would be the last person to support any measure that tramples on this freedom. But I also think a line should be drawn somewhere. We simply cannot allow people to brainwash citizens online for profit. We cannot allow wide-scale deception that threatens the truth and democratic institutions. Criticism of journalism and news organizations is healthy and expected. As truth tellers, we are accountable to the public we serve. But coordinated propaganda demonizing the media for acts we did not do or things we did not say is unethical and dangerous. Actors who pursue this tactic are protected by anonymity and the powerful people they serve. Journalists who have their names on the line every time we report don't stand a chance. We must at the very least put a name to these malign actors. With their outsized impact on democracies and the online community, anyone who engages in online propaganda must at least be made accountable for their actions, the way journalists are made accountable for our reports. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor now to Karen Gomez. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Your Honors. I am here speaking not in behalf of the institution that I used to work for, the Commission on Human Rights. We just ended our term and it has expired last May 5 this year. So allow me to just share with you some of my thoughts regarding the human rights situation post-elections. But allow me to just perhaps start with the hard truth that of course, with the overwhelming voter turnout of 83%, we know that the incoming president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has garnered 58% of that vote. And it is the hard truth. But then, of course, we all know that right now there are no election protests or legal actions that have been filed against the results of this election. So the administration or the incoming administration should be able to proceed and form the government unencumbered. So allow me to just talk about some human rights concerns that civil society has And perhaps I can probably share with you perhaps four D words, starting with the letter D: deaths, defenders, dissent, and disinformation, which was already ably discussed by our previous speaker, Pia. So we have continuing killings right now and other human rights violations. And this is something that needs to be addressed by the incoming administration, particularly human rights violations are as a result of the drug war, but also to take a look at the unfettered or unchecked power that this present government has, and we believe that this will continue in the coming administration. Activities on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism measures, where we see a conflation of and sowing confusion between human rights defenders, activists, and terrorists, as it were, because they are red tagged individuals. But most of them are just expressing dissent and critically engaging government in their profession as human rights defenders. I would just like to concentrate on perhaps among the human rights defenders that I would like to share with you is, of course, the plight of Senator Laila De Lima, who's been languishing in jail, and despite the recantation of 3 witnesses, there has been no review, no serious review of her case, and we would like this case to be thoroughly reviewed by the next administration, and hopefully cases which we believe to be trumped up cases to be withdrawn. Another case is, of course, the case of the recent arrest, abduction style of Dr. Nati Castro, where we see an emblematic case of how the rule of law is mangled to be able to feed the campaign against activists who are actually just trying to engage government with their views about how the administration is being run. Past human rights violations is something that we have to take a look at as well, because we know that even the human rights victims of the dark days of the dictatorship under Marcos Sr. has not been fully implemented through the law that allows for reparation and recognition of the sacrifices and the heroism of human rights victims during that time. The Memorial Museum has not yet been built, and we hope that this will be enabled so that the victims of martial law are also given the proper services that the law has been mandated to provide them. Accountability mechanisms is another issue that we want to be able to raise, because this is something that we did say that there is unchecked power. This current administration has gone ahead with its policy of tokhang, or the drug war, unfettered. There are still pending motions in the Supreme Court to give the proper form, the information that is needed by the petitioners in questioning the constitutionality of the policy of the drug war. What is needed, and I'm going to end here, is of course we need to have confidence building. We need to be able to increase the space for civil society to critically engage government. The 2022 elections has shown a strong political potential for a people's movement that must be enabled so that this movement can push for a progressive agenda. There has to be respect for dissent as well. And as we said, review the cases of trumped up charges against human rights defenders, particularly women human rights defenders, Senator Laila De Lima, Dr. Castro, and also Ms. Sally Ohano, which is a recent one. We have to enable accountability mechanisms to do its job in checking power and maintaining the balance or separation of power. What we do see right now is that when we take a look at the campaign of this incoming president, it talks about unity and reconciliation. But we want to see with that, there can be no unity and reconciliation without strong accountability, without access to justice of human rights victims of the past and present. And we want to be able to see how that unity and reconciliation looks like through the appointments that it will give, particularly in the Commission on Human Rights, the next batch of the Commission on Human Rights members. Also in its legislative agenda, we don't want to see, of course, the death penalty being reintroduced, nor the lowering of the minimum age of criminal responsibility and other measures. So I will end with that, but just as a last point, one of the perhaps the platforms that we can engage with government in is really the UN joint program that actually will assist the government in trying to improve the human rights situation on the ground. And this is something where we can fully engage and build confidence on as we move forward in the coming days of the Philippines. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you. I give now the floor to my colleague, so Isabelle Wissler for the EPP.
Merci beaucoup. Merci aussi aux deux intervenantes. Le problème évoqué auquel doit être confrontée la presse est celui de la...
Thank you for that presentation about disinformation, which we've heard a lot about. This is a problem that we have as well. When these problems arise in countries where democratic rules don't work properly, then the difficulties become enormous. I wanted to ask both speakers what they think we can do to help, whether in some way we can lend some support to them. And then the last speaker that we've heard from is fear that arises in a country such as the Philippines, and that means that the democratic space is smaller because people don't feel good and they get into very difficult situations. I would just like to ask regarding observation missions, what has been ascertained, what we can take away, and how we can help in the future. Thank you.
Merci Isabelle.
Thank you, Isabel. Nacho, please.
Cindy.
Sí, gracias.
Thank you. There is a bit of feedback coming from the speaker.
Populismo. Porque como decía...
Philippines, there's still some feedback coming from the speaker's microphone.
Escrito han conducido a unas elecciones con una alta participación y con un porcentaje de voto.
There's a high percentage of votes not discussed as a vote, and this has led to the dynasty of the Marcos. These issues are something that we need to think about, and why.
The translation is shaky, so it's going off and on, but it's shaky, just so everyone knows.
There was a feedback coming from the speaker to start off with.
Do you have problem for the translation or no? Est-ce que ça va pour la traduction?
Is the interpreting okay, says the speaker. There was feedback coming from the speaker to start off with.
Okay, Nacho, you can go.
Bueno, comienzo, si me permite.
I will start again.
Decía que este caso...
As I was saying, this case of the Philippines is a laboratory of populism. some politicians, as our guest has said, have gone through an election and got through with a big vote share to carry on the Marcos dynasty and the Duterte dynasty. So what we need to ask ourselves is, aside from studying these mechanisms, which is our work, why is human rights not attractive for some societies at the moment? That's the problem. And then a myth that we need to get over is that a ballot box solves all problems. That's entirely wrong. This is all to do with illiberal regimes. Some of them look legitimate and they have elections. But as I've been saying for years, democracy is what happens between elections, not just voting, because often vote counts reflect what have happened in society, but also how citizens have been informed or misinformed, whether they've had access to a free critical press, whether they have their opinion is in line with the common line. And that's something that we need to look at in terms of our electoral observation model, which allows us to examine these new phenomena. And the Philippines is a perfect example of the success of that. So in addition, as Isabel was saying, we need to see how we can help the critical parts of civil society that's been poisoned, as our first guest has said, but we also need to think about why our models of society are no longer as attractive as they were for decades, and why this populist logic, which is very well represented by the Philippines, flying in the face of human rights and the people are suffering, because we need to look at why the democratic model is no longer attractive. It's very difficult. We need to fight against authoritarian regimes elsewhere and give oxygen to civil society with the means that the EU has, our capacity to have bear influence with trade links and so on, so that we can help the people. But we're also up against these societies where they support solutions that are incompatible with our way of seeing things. So it's a real paradox, and we need to help people, but also look at ourselves, why this is happening.
Yes, Anna Newman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the two speakers. We are missing one. Let's hope this is not because he wasn't comfortable to appear here, which would be another blow. We have to accept that Marcos has won the elections, and as both speakers said, with a large majority. But this does not give him or anyone else a free pass to walk over human rights and minority rights. And that also has to be as clear as accepting that he has won. What I'm a bit worried about, and I would like to hear also comments from the speakers on this, there have been some alluded to some of the aspects. The first one is investigate into the violations of human rights that we have seen under the previous government, and given the fact that Sara Duterte is the vice president, which is the daughter of Rodrigo Duterte, and Marcos Jr. is the son of Ferdinand Marcos. I'm not too optimistic that we will see investigations, for example, into the war on drugs and other human rights abuses we have seen in the past, and I'm a bit afraid that we will see a culture of impunity, but I'm happy to take any hopeful signs from the speakers. The other question is looking forward. Do you expect any change in style of the new government and the new president when it comes to the war on drugs? So will this finally stop? when it comes to harassing journalists and making their life very difficult, as we have seen with Maria Ressa, but many, many, many other journalists, including these libel and slap cases. When it comes to political prisoners, you mentioned the case of Leila Dalima, but we know there's more when it comes to red tagging. So can we see any signs that under the new leadership, the country is moving a bit into a more positive direction, or can we just expect more of the same? Then, if I understood both speakers correctly, there has been a misuse of social media in the elections. I share this assessment. The question is, are there any attempts to change laws to make sure this doesn't happen again? And then comes the question, and Nacho just alluded to that, what do we as the European Union do with that? There's just so much we can do, that's true, but what we can do, we should do it consistently. And we had a number of urgency resolutions on the old government, clearly saying that we would also want to see the GSP Plus privileges being revoked if things don't change. I guess it's fair enough to give a benefit of the doubt to the new government, but we will have to check how they are doing. And I know that the Commission had an investigation or a review in the Philippines early this year on the GSP Plus, and that they will come to Parliament in the second half of this year with their report, where they also assess country by country on the 27 GSP Plus criteria. And I would strongly suggest, given the bleak outlook that we have at the moment on the current leadership, that we do a joint droit inter ad hoc mission to the Philippines in the second half, a short one, out of quota, to just check how things are before we are comfortable to comment on the Commission proposal, to get our own sense of this, and seriously make this a point where we make sure that, yes, Marcos won, but no, from our side, he cannot just walk over human rights and minority rights and expect us to cover up and continue to give the country privileges.
Thank you, Anna. I don't know if there is another member that wants to take the floor, if there is someone connected from other groups. I'm not sure about it. So I give you the floor now to Pia and Karen for the question coming from Anna, saying that we could have an ad hoc mission. We will try and have a discussion inside our coordinators. I think it's a good idea, and see if we have space for it during the second half of this year. But I think it's really something that we have to think about on the GSP Plus file. So I think it's really important to know when and where we need to have a privileged partnership with a country, and how to use this privileged partnership with a country. So I think it could be a good idea. Thank you, Anna. So Pia, I give you back the floor to answer to the question.
Hello, yes. So I would like to speak on 3 points, hoping to address the questions. Number one, how can the European Parliament help with fighting disinformation in the Philippines? As I mentioned in my speech, there were attempts to pass a social media registration law, which would have required any social media user to register their real names before creating an account, and to register their names when purchasing and using a SIM card. So I think that the Senate and the House of Representatives in the Philippines would really benefit from perhaps more advice, or maybe best practices coming from Europe, especially about your Digital Services Act, which we know is your way to kind of prevent disinformation from affecting your democracies. So I believe that our legislators, and if you engage with the media, for example, human rights groups in the Philippines, in coming up with a law that will protect our democracy from disinformation, but also protect any impingement on our rights to free speech, it would be great if you could share those best practices and help us come up with a better law, especially if you've already encountered any difficulties or issues with your measure in Europe. Second, there was a question on how Marcos will be different from Duterte. I think generally the expectation on the ground, especially among journalists, is we have a sense that Marcos wants to prove himself because he has baggage from his family. So we know that that internationally, right? His family name has a bad reputation with all over the world, and I believe that he will try to make up for that in some way. He has all the pressure on him to do better than what people expect. So I think we can use this. Hopefully, this is an opportunity to challenge him to be better. And I really urge all of the lawmakers present that if ever you come in contact with any Filipino government official, that you press this point consistently so that you can drive home the message to the Marcos administration that you are watching, and that you will be vigilant for any attempt to, for example, stifle the free press, to trample on human rights advocates, and to target legitimate dissent in the Philippines. About revoking the GSP plus benefits or perks, I think that definitely we would love to hear the review also. Like, I think in the media, journalists would love to hear how Europe has been reviewing the Philippines human rights situation, and we do believe that the government is closely watching this, and this is definitely something that I think could be a pressure point also to make sure that democratic rights and institutions are respected in the Philippines.
Thank you, Pia. Karen?
Thank you for the questions. I think Pia has actually excellently responded to them, and I have the same answers actually. Just your recent social media registration, not the social media registration, but the regulation that you earlier passed is something that we can take a look at. So probably share model laws with us, and the implementation of this newly passed regulation on media websites is something that we're eager to also look at. When it comes to, let's say, the mention about how human rights has become unattractive, well, I think at least we need to say we just have to keep on pounding the rock, because we know that this is the way to go. But then, of course, communication platforms have a lot to do with it. But then also the content or the messaging about human rights, how human rights is translated into everyday language, is something that we need to probably take a look at, how we can communicate for social behavior changes, and all those communication tools that we have. But basically, probably because it has become unattractive, human rights, is because it's founded on truths and facts. It's founded on standards and principles, and it goes with the rule of law. And all these other measures that actually try to win people's hearts and minds with lies is something that perhaps we can take a look at more closely, study it, and try to apply whatever we can within the bounds of the obligations that we have as responsible entities in a democracy. But other than that, dynasties in the Philippines, well, as we know, political families have actually replaced political parties since perhaps even before I was born. But one of the things that we're trying to take a look at is also election reform, election financing, the party system, representation in Congress or our parliaments, is something that we can take a look at. When it comes to observation missions, of course, there has to be an openness to that, because we know, whether we like it or not, the world is watching. And even if there are untruths propagated in the Philippines, a lot of the world is watching. The world can preserve the truth. Be in solidarity with the Philippines and other countries. And we need to do that. Now, investigation of human rights violations. We hope that, there is a continuing obligation for accountability. And this coming administration, I've always often said, comes perhaps with two baselines. The first baseline is what Pia has been saying earlier about the baggage that this administration led by President Marcos comes with. And that baggage is the dark days of martial rule, the atrocities there. And he has to reach out to them. That's the first baseline. The second baseline, perhaps, is where he will pick up from. And that's the Duterte administration, where you have killings that have actually surpassed in terms of scale and pace the killings of the the first Marcos administration. So this is something that we only can hope that the accountability will be better this time. Of course, there will be a change in style. He's another person. But one of the things perhaps good going for the war on drugs is that there is an ICC process, which we hope will continue because if there is a continuation of perhaps a concentration of power and very weak check and balance mechanisms, then the ICC could be the way to go. But there are other mechanisms. Other mechanisms are found in the Human Rights Council, for instance, in the treaty body mechanisms, which is, of course, tied with the GSP Plus as well. What else is there? GSP Plus. Okay, of course, we are committed to follow whatever was agreed upon application as a GSP Plus beneficiary. But we do hope that some of the low-lying fruits that could be done away with, like an agenda on the death penalty, reintroduction of the death penalty, or the agenda of lowering the minimum age of criminal responsibility. These are things that are so easy to do that this incoming administration can already do away with, so that at least confidence is built and to show that they are really for unity and reconciliation. So those are just my responses to the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen and Pia. I give now the floor to Mark Gallagher, Head of Division for the Asia, Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Following the election of Ferdinand Marcos, to which EU election expert mission was invited, our hope is to deepen relations with the Philippines under our partnership and cooperation agreement. We want to work with the new administration to assist the Philippines in living up to the international human rights commitments to which it is a party. The protection of human rights is an integral part of our relationship. I would like in particular to recall the last GSP Plus monitoring mission, which has been raised several times, of February and March this year. During that mission, our team met government representatives, including the Departments of Justice, Labour and Employment, the Presidential Human Rights Committee, the police, the Drug Enforcement Agency and others. They also met representatives of civil society, including human rights defenders, trades unions and employers. The mission's key objective was to review progress in implementing the 27 UN and ILO conventions ratified and applicable under the GSP Plus scheme. In particular, discussions focused on the government's actions regarding the war on drugs, accountability for extrajudicial killings, restrictions of civil society space, including the red tagging of human rights defenders, freedom of expression, opinion and media, anti-torture legislation, freedom of association, child labour and drugs policy. The EU conveyed a message of urgency to the Filipino authorities to address all these issues of concern, and that is our key message to the new administration. The effective implementation of international commitments on trade and sustainable development forms the basis of the Philippines' privileged access to the EU market. We've been working together with the Filipino government since the country joined the scheme in 2014. While we recognise the climate of frank discussions with the Filipino government during the mission, we also reiterated the need for tangible and measurable progress on issues of concern. The information gathered by the monitoring mission will feed into the next report that the Commission will present to the Parliament and Council in the second half of this year on the implementation of the scheme, as Hannah Neumann mentioned. We have taken note of some steps forward under the current administration. For example, the signature of the UN Joint Programme, which Karen Gomez-Dumpit raised, to support the country's capacity to protect human rights. The EU is supporting the joint programme with €300,000 under the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. We hope that the small steps we have seen will become bigger. We remain concerned by enforced disappearances and the death toll associated with the war on drugs, as well as the lack of effective, impartial and transparent investigations and the shrinking space for civil society. Maria Ressa faces harassment and charges for libel. Let me also recall, as some have, the case of Senator de Lima. She stood in the general election but was not re-elected. Her detention has been recognised as arbitrary by the UN. She has been in pre-trial detention already for 5 years. We took note of yesterday's announcement by a panel of Department of Justice prosecutors that there is, quote, good reason to continue her prosecution. As many in this Parliament, we applaud the Senator's resilience and hope that the new administration will now act appropriately. Her rights to due process must be respected. On this occasion, let me also congratulate in particular Karen Gomez-Dumpit, the former Commissioner of the Commission on Human Rights, for your work. We await the nomination of your replacement and hope that a similarly strong, independent-minded candidate will replace you, Karen. With 2 more years as the ASEAN coordinator for relations with the EU and the EU-ASEAN summit ahead, we look forward to working with the Philippines in supporting the multilateral system, the rules-based international order, as well as to promote and protect human rights. We will also continue our long-term support for a peaceful, secure and inclusive Mindanao. Let me finish by saying that under the current administration, the Philippines has been the only ASEAN government to vote with the EU on every Ukraine-related UNGA resolution since the war began, including on the suspension of Russia from the Human Rights Council. This underlines the substantially shared positions we have when it comes to multilateralism and the international rule of law. We hope this will become more so in the human rights field also. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes to continue this debate. So, Nacho.
Hoy no me voy a enfadar con el...
I'm not going to get annoyed with the EAS representative, but just one point that I've made previously. One of our points of control in democratic quality in our member countries is electoral observation of elections with our standards. I've read a summary of an apparently international electoral observation. It's an institution of Asian countries that the Philippines are part of. Now, sometimes authoritarian regimes dodge credible electoral observations by not inviting the EU or other international bodies. And I've previously proposed, and I wanted to reiterate to our colleagues of the Commission, who I welcome from the EAS, the idea that we have excessive instruments with which we can observe pretty much all elections throughout the world for a reason that's very simple. Now, if you want to get into GSP+, then that means an open invitation to the EU for electoral observation. If you want an association agreement with the EU, then signing that means an open invitation to electoral observation. So we have loads of instruments to get around this habitual practice where you can't observe elections because you don't get an invitation. But we need to deal with this, because if a country wants to have political relations with the EU by means of an association agreement or a GSP plus style agreement, then you need to say that that agreement means that you extend an open invitation to the EU for electoral observation missions so that they decide when to go and see them. And I do understand the logic of this. I understand that the war situation makes strange bedfellows. We're all aware of that. And we know, being realistic, that in some way we need to be more flexible in some situations with our standards, our requirements. But voting through UNs shouldn't be a passport to whatever you want. That often happens, and I have said this regarding Turkey, and I would like ES to say this, the ES to say this regarding everything else. We've got behaviour that isn't aligned with the EU. That isn't the issue. It is that countries that want international relations to be according to law, and to ask countries that were colonies to be aligned with the EU, that's the wrong discourse. Countries align themselves to international law, not the EU. Those countries that have aligned with the UN, well, that's not a passport to carry on with dirty business domestically.
So we have Julio Teehanke that is connected now. So if it's possible to give him the floor for some minutes, because finally we have this connection. So if it's possible to have and to give him the floor. So Julio, you have the floor.
Mr. Teehanke, Julio?
Yes, yes. Am I coming in clear?
Yeah, we can hear you and we can see you.
Thank you so much.
So you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties. I would like to thank the subcommittee for the invitation to speak. And I would just like to say a couple of things regarding the results of the recently concluded presidential elections in the country, in the Philippines. Now aside from the election conducted last month, 2022 will also mark the 50th anniversary of the declaration of martial law by the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos. And it would be the height of historical irony that on September of this year, on the 50th anniversary of the declaration of martial law, the sitting president would be Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And how did this happen? Despite all the uncertainties that were raised during the election campaign, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. won by 31 million votes. No? And he wins practically 59% of the total votes cast, making him the first majority president in the Fifth Republic of the Philippines. Now, for scholars who have studied democratization, one of the puzzling outcomes in most countries that underwent democratic transitions is the return to power of parties and personalities who have deep roots in the dictatorship. And it is confounding to note that after gaining the right to pick their leaders in free and fair elections, people would still vote for candidates identified with a previous authoritarian regime. Now, despite being ousted from power and relegated to the political fringe for more than 3 decades, the Marcos political dynasty has made a historic political comeback. Despite losing the vice presidential race in 2016 and his subsequent electoral protests, the son and namesake of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos has emerged as the winner of this year's election. Why? Several accounts, particularly from the West, have pointed to disinformation. While this is true, because as early as the 90s, when the Marcoses returned from their exile from abroad, they have already embarked on a long-term project to revise the historical narrative. And after more than 3 decades, they have succeeded with the help of social media and their disinformation network, the use of trolls and the like. But then again, not all 31 million of Filipinos who voted for him could have been misled by social media. There are other possible problems or reason. The post-Marcos regime was premised on two complementary objectives. One is democratization, and the other one is the removal of all vestiges of the Marcos dictatorship. Unfortunately, this has failed. The attempt to bring the promise of the first people power revolution in 1986 that ousted the dictator has actually failed because the succeeding presidential administration have failed to deliver on the promises of EDSA. And this has resulted in a politics of frustration and anger and disenchantment that paved the way for the rise of an illiberal populist like Rodrigo Duterte, who in turn paved the way for the second coming of the Marcoses. Authoritarian nostalgia has been silently simmering in the public's political preference since the mid-2000s. And this is actually the trend not only in the Philippines, this has always been the trend in the Southeast Asian region. And among the reasons why Ferdinand Marcos Jr. won, well, it's part of the worldwide trend of democratic backsliding or democratic regression due to the collective failure to consolidate democracy, push for the necessary political reform, as was mentioned earlier by former Commissioner Gomez-Dumpit. Clans and not parties have been the building block of Philippine politics. And what we have seen is a consolidation of dynastic politics, the consolidation of ethno-linguistic bailiwicks and dynastic clans and their patronage machinery. It's a failure to dismantle patronage democracy and deepen democracy. Then, authoritarian populism, the state-sponsored violence like the EJK, war on drugs, the red tagging, disinformation and misinformation, the trolling of this outgoing administration of President Duterte. And there are those who would claim that there have been some EDSA fatigue, EDSA being the name of the People Power Uprising in 1986. The reliance of the post-EDSA political class on moral politics and elitism, which has been deemed as hypocritical by the majority of the masses. The weakening of the EDSA people power narrative and the rise of the EDSA anti-1986 or anti-EDSA coalition, or those who were politically marginalized by EDSA. And at the heart of it all is authoritarian nostalgia. Because of our failure to undergo transitional justice, the vestiges of the old authoritarianism were able to easily come back and influence and form a democratic ambivalence among the middle class. In short, apparently the Marcoses never left. And what do we expect from this administration? Well, some would say that he might repudiate the Fifth Republic and establish his own Sixth Republic. That is a possibility, but given the bigger problem of fully exiting the pandemic and fully recovering the economy from the scars of the pandemic, I don't think this administration would gamble his tremendous political capital in doing this. There are those also who are saying that he's a different person. He might be following some of the political playbook from his father, but definitely he is driven by the desire to redeem the name of his family. And perhaps, just like the other son of another president, the late President Benigno Noynoy Aquino, he might just appoint the right people, read his speeches well, and be a benign president. So, but then again, given the political baggages and a significant portion of the Filipino voters who rejected his candidacy, it remains to be seen whether the second Marcos presidency would follow the path of the early Ferdinand Marcos, the democratic Ferdinand Marcos of 1965, or he will follow the footsteps of the 1986 Ferdinand Marcos, the failed dictator. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. Thank you. C'est un plaisir d'avoir pu être reconnecté.
Well, it was great that we were managed to connect with you, although we now have to close the debate on the Philippines. A lot of messages have been sent. The Philippines really are a case study for us in the relations we will have with the countries of the Southeast. We heard the External Action Service tell us that there are some small steps being taken forwards, and the Committee on Human Rights will be working closely in conjunction with the report that you have set out for us. We will, of course, have a look at how our relations with these countries might be envisaged. European Union and Philippines, thank you very much. And we are now going to move on to the next item on our agenda.
La dernière évolution.
The recent developments in the protection of journalists around the world. The situation is difficult, but it's essential in order to have transparency of information and participation. We know that the security of journalists are very threatened in the world. Journalists are targeted and face unprecedented dangers to carry out their work, particularly in war contexts. Recently, the journalist Frederick Leclerc Imhoff was killed in Ukraine while reporting on evacuating civilians. In May, the journalist Shirina Bouakle was shot while she was covering the Israeli army operation in the occupied West Bank. And Dom Phillips, who was investigating on the environment, has disappeared somewhere in the rainforest in Brazil, together with a local leader from indigenous community. Our subcommittee addressed on multiple occasions challenges that human rights defenders and journalists face to protect freedom of expression. Most recently, DROA debated the alarming developments in Mexico, and this debate paved the way to the adoption of an urgency resolution on the situation of journalists and human rights defenders in the country. More recently, on the occasion of Press Freedom Day, 3rd of May this year, during the plenary session in Strasbourg, MEPs proposed a series of measures to counteract the threat that the famous SLAP, strategic lawsuits against public participation, pose to journalists, NGOs and civil society in Europe. In order to tackle the issue of violence against journalists and in consideration of the present alarming global situation, DRA decided to draw an own initiative report on the safety of journalists in non-EU countries and the role of the EU on the matter. Our colleague Isabel Wiesler-Lima will prepare, she's here with us today, will prepare this as rapporteur. In order to support her work, our committee has commissioned a briefing and an in-depth analysis. The briefing will be presented in September and the in-depth analysis will be presented today. They were sent out on the 10th of June. In addition to our author, Dr. Mitchell, we considered it important to gather inputs of experienced journalists from different backgrounds, from different professions as well. And so, first of all, let me give the floor to Tamsin Mitchell, independent researcher and consultant. You have the floor for 8 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Tamsin Mitchell, and I'm here to present this study entitled Safety of Journalists in Non-EU Countries, State and Non-State Mechanisms and the Role of the EU. Next slide, please. As you know, violence against journalists and impunity is a growing problem worldwide. The issue has received a great deal of international attention since the late 1990s, and especially since the 2012 UN Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity. This has led to many resolutions, initiatives and instruments at UN, regional and multilateral level, including by the EU. But how effective are they, given that attacks on journalists are still rising? This study provides a small-scale, qualitative, comparative analysis of international mechanisms and tools aimed at protecting and ensuring the safety of journalists, broadly defined, and their use and usefulness in 3 non-EU countries with difficult political contexts: the Philippines, El Salvador, and Tunisia. It places special emphasis on the role of the EU in using and strengthening its own and other international instruments. Next slide, please. A few points about methodology. The 3 case studies were selected to represent a range of regions, severity of attacks on journalists and media freedom, and types of bilateral relationships with the EU. However, they also share several characteristics. They're all partial democracies, lower middle income countries, and all currently have governments that are overtly hostile towards journalists and the media. The findings are based on 1, a review of available academic and grey literature, and 2, an in-depth, semi-structured online interviews with 15 representatives of the EU, UN, and key civil society organisations that work to support journalists at risk across the 3 countries. The main data source for the case studies are the interviews, with written sources used where possible to back up interviewees' statements. Most data collection took place between February and April this year, and so the study really offers a snapshot of the situation in the 3 countries at that point in time. Next slide, please. The case studies clearly demonstrate that the EU delegations and other international actors in all 3 countries are active in promoting journalist safety and freedom of expression to varying degrees. They also show that their presence and support, both financial and moral, are valued by CSOs working in this area, even if the 2 sides don't always agree on the seriousness of the risks faced by journalists or the best ways of addressing them. But there's considerable room for improvement. Overall, there's a clear disparity between, on one hand, the multitude of international journalist protection measures and the high levels of international activity, and on the other hand, the relatively low awareness and use of these at domestic level by both EU delegations and CSOs. Next slide, please. The international protection mechanisms and tools most frequently mentioned by the UN, EU, and CSOs across the 3 countries were 1. The European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights and other international funding. 2. Public actions such as statements and events. 3. Training for journalists, CSOs, and officials. And 4. Certain protection mechanisms of the UN, such as special rapporteurs and the Universal Periodic Review, and of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, such as precautionary measures, hearings, and petitions. Again, the EU and UN and CSOs did not always agree on how effective these different approaches were, and CSOs often expressed a desire for improvements, for example, more longer-term and sustainable funding and more frequent and robust public statements. In all 3 countries, EU officials, but not CSOs, place significant emphasis on political dialogue as a means of raising freedom of expression and related concerns with the state and pushing for improvements. The private nature of these discussions and the apparent lack of regular consultation and debriefing with CSOs means that their frequency, content, and outcomes are generally unknown to outsiders, and their impact is difficult to assess. Next slide, please. Across the 3 countries, certain protection mechanisms and tools were not mentioned or were not used as follows. At EU level, protectdefenders.eu, the EU's mechanism to protect human rights defenders at risk worldwide. Démarche, or diplomatic protests, the EU Special Representative on Human Rights, and outreach and emergency assistance to individual journalists. At UN level, UN treaty bodies and UNESCO complaint procedures. Next slide, please. Other protection instruments were apparently underused as follows. Public statements clearly condemning violence and impunity and supporting journalists and media freedom was the main protection tool that CSOs felt was underused by the EU, UN, and other international actors. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights, including its Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, was apparently little used in Tunisia, unlike in El Salvador, where the equivalent regional body, the Inter-American Commission, was frequently used and generally favoured over the UN. Although funding was a key concern for local CSOs, there appeared to be a lack of knowledge of the full range of international funding opportunities available. Could you go forward 2 slides, please, to slide number 9? I'll just quickly highlight some of the study's general recommendations due to time constraints, but please note that the case studies do contain country-specific recommendations as well as the general recommendations at the end of the report. So the EU and other international actors should, 1, continue, strengthen and increase support for funding programmes, public statements and events, training for journalists and officials, and the use of key UN and Inter-American Commission protection mechanisms, and consider providing more long-term and core funding for relevant CSOs. 2, raise awareness of and build capacity around using the full range of EU and other international protection mechanisms and tools among both their staff and CSOs that support journalists, while bearing in mind context relevance. This should include promoting awareness and use of regional systems of human rights protection and funding opportunities linked to the EU, UN, UNESCO and embassies. Next slide, please. The EU should ensure that its funding programmes are known and accessible to local CSOs that work on journalist safety. 2, should address the disconnect between the EU's preference for private action and CSO's desire for more public action in relation to attacks on journalists and media freedom. 3, it should promote awareness of the guidelines on human rights dialogues with partner and third countries among EU delegations and local CSOs. 4, review how EU delegations assess the impact of their work on journalist safety and freedom of expression. 6, consider increasing the human and financial resources available to EU delegations to focus on this issue. And 7, commission a full external evaluation of the EU guidelines on freedom of expression and their implementation. Next slide, please. The European Parliament and the Subcommittee on Human Rights should continue to carry out missions to non-EU countries where journalist safety and protection are at risk. It should consider issuing more urgency resolutions and press releases highlighting restrictions and attacks, and press the EEAS for greater transparency in terms of how EU delegations measure impact and effectiveness in relation to their promotion of journalist safety and freedom of expression. Next slide, please. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting to have all these recommendations. So thank you for your work, and I hope that we will find this recommendation in the report that we will have in this committee with Isabelle. So now I give the floor to Christophe Deloire, secrétaire général de Rapporteurs sans frontières. Is he connected? Yeah?
Oui.
Pardon, vous êtes connecté, mais je ne vous vois pas.
Alors, pardonnez-moi.
Et sans vous voir, on ne vous traduit pas. Donc, on a besoin de vous voir.
Confus.
I'm sorry, we can't translate you if you can't be seen.
J'en suis désolé.
OK, parfait. Alors, je vais donner la parole à Jean-Paul Marteau.
I'm going to give the floor to Jean-Paul Marteau, journalist coordinator of the Council of Europe's Report on Safety of Journalists platform on press freedom in Europe and former foreign affairs editor of Le Soir. Everyone knows this in Belgium, the Le Soir. You have the floor, sir. I'm a Belgian, of course. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation. I think I've got 7 minutes. I will try my best to respect the timing. I'd like to refer to Mexico by way of an introduction because many journalists in Mexico have been, more than 500 Mexican journalists have been killed since the beginning of the year. And that shows a certain trend. And I think we can assess some of the mechanisms which we need to put in place. First of all, Mexico is very much in the thrall of organized crime. And over the years, this has developed. This participation of criminal groups in the killing of journalists, and it's something which has involved, for example, Europol. Since 2021, they published a report which shows the escalation of this phenomenon and also its extension into Europe. Daphne Caruana is an example, and Peter de Vries in the Netherlands and the journalist in Slovakia also. So it shows you that we're getting a signal here. It's the canary in the mine. And there's increasing aggression. In Belgium, we've had a warning from the public prosecutor, about the criminalisation regarding this matter, and in particular in, for example, the port of Rotterdam, where there's also a link with drugs imports. So organised criminality is an important phenomenon in all this, and has a trans-border nature. Obviously, we want to support journalists outside the European Union, but now we have within the European Union, for example, in Italy with the 'Ndrangheta, a mafia organisation of the crime. And we have had reports from the United Nations against this kind of criminality and drugs, and they've decided to implement some actions given the dangers which journalists are facing all over the world. We should remember that solidarity towards journalists outside the EU is not just a question of values, although it clearly is that, but also a question of our own interests. It's in the interests of the European Union to know what is happening all over the world with journalists. And that's why the president of Colombia actually summarized the information in terms of its globalization. So we have to censure and criticize everywhere. Or rather, I'm sorry, the interpreter corrects herself, in China, the kind of censure which is taking place could also happen here in Europe. So we have to make sure that the values of the European Union are reflected. The Mexican situation also allows us to reflect upon some measures that have been taken at international level to combat this scourge of violence. In 2012, for example, there was a mechanism introduced, a report was published, and the comments there were quite general in nature. Very often there are technical problems, there are problems of definition, at what stage does a journalist require protection? So fundamentally, it's a question also of political investment and political will. We have also a resolution of Parliament which sets out the political context in Mexico and the support of the president, generally speaking, and the lacks in some of the Mexican institutions, which have to be overcome if we have to implement these recommendations. Now, I think also that the European Union, due to the agreements which have been signed with third countries, for example, the global agreement with Mexico, the strategic partnership agreement, they have some tools at their disposal, in particular the human rights dialogue. We've already heard about the report by Michel and the lack of knowledge that we actually have of for example, the information which is NGOs in Mexico have. We have to obviously think, therefore, about how the European Union can use these instruments that they have at their disposal more. Over and above the use of these instruments, which allows us to have a human rights dialogue, which is absolutely essential for the protection of journalists here in Europe and also in other countries. This is a dialogue which is necessary, and that leads to a fundamental question. How far do politics in the European Union contribute to creating an environment which allows us to protect journalists in danger? For example, their sources of information, their human rights, and so on. Recently, there was a disappearance of Dom Philippe and his expert. Now, are the policies being implemented in Brazil enough to protect and defend the indigenous population there? And what about the struggle against deforestation in that country? That can be looked at. Does Mercosur foresee some kind of a serious study concerning that? Can our agreements therefore also have a negative effect on the situation on the ground for journalists? And just a last point, I have a proposal to make, a suggestion to make. In many of the communications of the European Parliament or of the United Nations, they talk a lot about human rights. That's referred to. I think being, however, more important to include journalists in that defense of human rights. They're often not included because they are also defenders of human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If we have a camera, we'll give the floor to our next speaker, Christophe Deloy. We can now see.
Merci à vous, Madame la Présidente, Madame la rapporteure, Mesdames et Messieurs les parlementaires. Je vais commencer par une anecdote. Le fondateur de l'Inde moderne, Nehru Gandhi, posait la question: qu'est-ce que c'est que la liberté de la presse? Est-ce que c'est la liberté des rédacteurs en chef? Est-ce que c'est la liberté des journalistes? Est-ce que c'est la liberté des...
I'm afraid the sound quality is too poor for the interpreters to interpret.
La liberté des propriétaires de médias de faire passer des contenus n'ayant rien à voir avec l'intérêt général. Ça n'est évidemment pas la conception de la liberté de la presse que nous avons, ni les conceptions que nous voulons défendre. Mais je raconte cette anecdote pour insister sur un point, c'est qu'il nous revient de travailler sur deux types de prisons. Les prisons visibles, celles avec des barreaux dans lesquelles des journalistes sont enfermés. Au moment où nous parlons, plus de 400 journalistes, pardonnez-moi, plus de 400 journalistes sont incarcérés dans le monde du fait de leur exercice professionnel, mais aussi des prisons invisibles, celles qui, sur la base du droit, de l'argent, de la technologie, permettent d'enfermer l'exercice de cette fonction sociale.
Juste une seconde, on me dit qu'il n'y a pas...
Just a moment. I've heard that there is no interpreting, says the chair. The interpreters confirm that the sound quality is too poor for interpretation for this speaker.
Franchement, il y a la caméra.
We've got a camera, says the speaker. We've got sound.